I'm Robin McKenna, and I'm a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Liverpool. I'm here today to talk about my new book, Non-Ideal Epistemology, which has just been published with Oxford University Press. I know they say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but I've received so many compliments on this cover that I very much invite you to judge it by its cover. It is just as good as the cover makes it look. So I'm not planning today to go into too much detail. I'm just going to talk about some broad themes from the book. So what follows is a little less nuanced than what I say in the book, although of course I would say that. My hope is just that this sparks your interest enough that you want to read the whole thing, complete with the various clarifications and qualifications. So I guess I should start by explaining what I mean by non-ideal epistemology. Before doing that, though, I have to take a further step back and say something about what epistemology is, or how I understand epistemology. So as anyone who's taken a class on epistemology, or perhaps taught a class themselves might recognise, epistemology is kind of odd, often very abstract discipline. Most definitions of it say that epistemology is concerned with knowledge. It's often defined as the theory of knowledge. And certainly that's an accurate description of a lot of epistemology as it is practiced today. We epistemologists have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what knowledge is, and we've, for better or worse, subjected our students to extensive discussion of these matters. This is very much the kind of thing that critics of epistemology like to make sometimes light-hearted, other times less so light-hearted, fun of us for. So criticisms of epistemology as being all about cases, all about counterexamples, as always requiring us to have intuitions about fake barns, Fords, or Brown being in Barcelona. Perhaps you're familiar with these kinds of criticisms. So I myself think that these criticisms can go too far. There's nothing wrong with being interested in knowledge or the nature of knowledge, and this is a subject which I think kind of inherently calls for careful, if not always exciting thought. What I think, though, that this definition of epistemology as concerned with knowledge, and the critics of that definition, what they're missing is an equally valuable part of the history of epistemology, and also what I think is one of the most interesting kind of branches of epistemology being discussed today by epistemologists. This is a kind of epistemology that is more interested in how to get knowledge than in what knowledge is. A kind of epistemology that's more practical than theoretical, a kind that is centrally interested in inquiry, in how we gather knowledge about the world around us. This branch could perhaps be described as interested in the ethics of inquiry. Now, when you look at foundational texts in the history of epistemology, somewhat interestingly, you don't really find that much discussion of the nature of knowledge. What you find is a lot more discussion of how to get knowledge. That is, what you find is a lot more discussion of inquiry. Descartes and Locke, to take just two examples, were very much interested in inquiry. They were interested in the methods we should use to get knowledge about the world around us. So of course, some inquiries are the kind of thing you can conduct as an individual, but once we recognise that there's only so much knowledge you can get by yourself, the question of how to get knowledge becomes the question of how we together as a community can get knowledge. Inquiry is usually a communal activity rather than an individual enterprise. And once we view inquiry as a communal activity, that leads to further questions. Questions about who is doing who gets to inquire, questions about how we can work together to get knowledge, so how exactly our inquiry should be structured, questions about what the environment would have to be like to support our inquiries. An environment could be more or less conducive to inquiring into a particular matter. Now, once you go down that route, it becomes difficult, if not I would say impossible, to neatly separate the purely epistemological questions from more ethical and political questions. If you're really interested in communal inquiry, in inquiring together, you're going to have to say something about the community that is doing the inquiring. You're going to have to talk about the structure of the community, the internal dynamics, the distribution of resources within it, and so on. And these are inherently political questions, although they're the kinds of political questions that I think are of particular concern to epistemologists, at least if they're interested in inquiry. So, long story short, I am interested in the kind of epistemology that is focused on inquiry, where inquiry is viewed as a communal activity. So that means that what I'm doing is what is nowadays called social epistemology. And the book starts with a divide between, if you like, two camps in social epistemology. One of these camps is more interested in the kind of foundational issues in social epistemology. Issues like what you have to do to get knowledge from testimony, or what the rational response to disagreement is. So foundational issues in what are called the epistemologies of testimony and disagreement. So this first camp is more or less continuous with traditional epistemology. The concerns seem broadly similar. Practitioners in this first camp tend to work with quite idealized models of inquirers, of the interactions between those inquirers, and the spaces in which they interact. It might sometimes sound like practitioners in the first camp are talking about the real world, but really they're talking about these idealized models. So this is the ideal camp in social epistemology, and its practitioners do what I'm calling in the book ideal epistemology. But there's a second camp, and this second camp is less interested in these foundational issues and more interested in practical, concrete questions. Questions like, how are our systems of knowledge production dysfunctional? In what ways do they entrench inequalities and injustices? What explains the prevalence of certain forms of ignorance? Why are so many people suspicious of something like the COVID vaccine, or the near unanimous consensus among scientists that human activity is causing climate change? As these questions might indicate, the concerns of those in the second camp are far less continuous with the concerns of traditional epistemologists. Practitioners in this camp work with less idealized models of inquirers, the interactions between them, and the spaces in which they interact. So if you're interested in what drives something like suspicion of a vaccine, you're interested in the actual psychology of actual people who are vaccine hesitant, or perhaps even vaccine skeptics. So this kind of epistemology is at least attempting to talk about the real world, to address concrete social questions through the lens of epistemology. So this obviously is the non-ideal camp in social epistemology, and its practitioners do what I call in the book non-ideal epistemology. So that's the basic divide, ideal versus non-ideal epistemology, these two camps in social epistemology. So I want to pause for a second here to emphasize two things. So the first, as I just said, but let me say it in more detail, the divide I'm drawing in the book between ideal and non-ideal epistemology is primarily a divide within social epistemology. So the claim is that it is possible, indeed common, to pursue social epistemology in a way that is highly idealized. One of the central claims of my book is that in many ways the distinction I draw, this distinction between ideal and non-ideal epistemology, is more useful than the distinction between traditional or individual and social epistemology. The ideal epistemologist usually works within the same problem space as the traditional epistemologist, with a few more tools and with a kind of nod towards our social embeddedness. The non-ideal epistemologist, on the other hand, is interested in quite a different problem space and develops or borrows new tools with which to tackle that problem space. The second thing I want to emphasize is that, and this is really important for me to emphasize, I'm not saying that there's necessarily anything wrong with ideal epistemology. In general, idealization is often appropriate. There's no general problem with idealization. Sometimes it's good, other times it's bad. Sometimes, indeed, it's a necessity. Consider the role of idealization in physics, for example. It would be very hard to develop your physical theories if you didn't make any idealizations whatsoever. So the aim of my book is not really to argue against ideal epistemology. Rather, it's to argue for non-ideal epistemology. I do this by identifying several problems or questions that I think call for the non-ideal approach. So as such, most of the book isn't really about methodology. What I'm trying to do is to make the case for non-ideal epistemology by doing it, by actually doing non-ideal epistemology, rather than talking about doing it. So this, even though it has a couple of chapters that are quite methodological, the bulk of the book is not on methodology. It's more concrete than that. So I say it's more concrete. Can I give some concrete examples? Yes, I can. Let me give 2 examples that take up much of the book. So the first, as already mentioned, is the problem of science denial, with a particular focus on climate change denial. This is a problem that, of course, should be of interest to an epistemologist of ignorance, or someone who's interested in the kind of what's driving socially important forms of ignorance. And I think we need the tools of non-ideal epistemology to tackle this problem of science denial. Why? Well, first we have to understand what drives it. So what actually drives it? What drives actual climate change skeptics? And this is both at the psychological and the sociological level. So that requires in-depth engagement with psychology and sociology, not the construction of idealized models. We're interested in what's actually driving the phenomenon, not what might be driving it. The second thing is that if we want to do something about science denial, so change the minds of, for example, climate change skeptics, we have to identify interventions or solutions that actually have a chance of succeeding. Interventions that might actually change the mind of actual science deniers. And that requires looking at the psychology of persuasion and the empirical evidence about which methods of persuasion are likely to be effective in changing the minds of those who are resistant to being persuaded, for example, about the severity of climate change, or perhaps even its reality. So you might kind of object here that this is all very well, but this differs so radically from a more traditional kind of epistemology that it barely even qualifies as epistemology. Isn't this just some kind of psychology, you might ask? The crucial point, though, is that the project here has got normative aspirations. The idea is that we can use the tools of epistemology to assess proposals made by psychologists, science communicators, and others working to understand what drives science denial and who are interested in doing something about science denial. So, for example, one popular proposal in these literatures concerns how scientific issues like climate change are framed. It's possible to frame issues in ways that sidestep predictable partisan responses. Kind of crude, but hopefully will do the job. If you want to convince a free marketeer of the need to do something about climate change, best not to lead with overthrow of capitalism, right? So that's not going to be very persuasive. It's likely going to get their hackles up. A far better idea will be to lead with, for example, the role that industry, innovation, science and technology can play in solving the problem. The suggestion is that we can view that kind of framing as circumventing the partisan political biases that might prevent someone from properly engaging with the scientific evidence on the issue at question. Framing an issue in a way that is more amenable to the target of the persuasive message can enable them to respond more rationally to the actual evidence. You kind of get round the various biases and so on that are stopping them from engaging with the evidence. That means that there's a clear epistemological rationale for framing issues in certain ways. Framing an issue in a particular way has the potential to do more than just change minds. It can lead people to form more rational attitudes about the issues in question. Ultimately, perhaps, it can lead to people having more knowledge. That's the first example, and hopefully you can see the kind of non-ideal aspect here, right? So of course, none of these interventions would be necessary if human beings were more ideal, were less prone to certain kinds of biases. They're necessary because human beings are less than ideal and are prone to certain kinds of biases. But we can still make a distinction between the sorts of persuasive interventions that improve and enhance rationality and the kinds that might not. And the first kind are the ones that, as epistemologists of science communication, let's say, we would want to be recommending. Okay, that was the first example. The second example, slightly different. This concerns our responsibilities as inquirers. So I was talking earlier about inquiry as a communal endeavour. In communal endeavours, you might think we're going to have certain roles and responsibilities, certain things that we should do and should not do. So in particular, I want to focus in on a particular kind of responsibility, a responsibility pertaining to dissent and attempts to kind of rock the boat and express dissatisfaction with existing consensus. So if someone has an alternative view on some matter that we are jointly invested in investigating, to what extent are you required to engage with that alternative view? If they put forward their alternative in good faith, are you required to respond, to try to find reasons for rejecting or accepting that view, and so on? So, as will be familiar to many of you, many are tempted by a kind of Millian, in the sense of John Stuart Mill, attitude here. Engaging, these people will say, is typically beneficial, if only because it may well improve your own understanding of the issue in question. It may have other benefits to everyone else, but certainly it should do that. It should allow you to get a kind of better handle on your own reasons for endorsing whatever view you happen to endorse. It may even be, the Millian thought continues, that in certain circumstances, your inability to respond, to find a problem with this alternative viewpoint, suggests that you should be less confident in your own view than you in fact are. After all, if you kind of had a good handle on why the view is the right view to hold, you'd be able to respond. So goes the Millian thought. So of course, many have rejected this Millian attitude, and often on the grounds that it is unrealistic. So grounds that are kind of anticipating the point that I want to make, which is that the problem with this proposal is that it's too ideal. So the claim I want to make in the book is that the best way to view the dispute between the defender and the critic of the Millian attitude is through the lens of my distinction between ideal and non-ideal epistemology. From the kind of more ideal perspective, a perspective in which we abstract away from the often unsavoury nature of real discussions and debates, Mill's views about the value of frank and robust discussion and debate are undeniably attractive. You read on liberty and it's very stirring. You think this sounds wonderful. You can be quite thoroughly persuaded when you're reading those arguments. However, of course, from the less ideal perspective, the perspective from which we recognise the ways in which real debates are often nothing like the seminar room discussion, or the kinds of debates that Mill seems to have in mind, from that perspective, Mill's views seem a lot less attractive. So once you kind of think for a second about how actual debates go, you realise that however persuasive Mill's arguments might have seemed, they don't really work in the real world. The crucial point I want to kind of make here is that, well, we're working here with kind of two polar opposites, right? Kind of the perspective that is what wants to champion Mill's views and the perspective that wants to kind of rubbish them. The point I want to make is that whether someone is tempted to agree or disagree with Mill and the Millian attitude is going to depend on the extent to which they think the real world is close to the ideal world, right? So it's going to depend on whether you think that the real world is closer to the ideal world or the non-ideal world. What often seems to underlie more ideal approaches to epistemology and to philosophy in general is the idea that the idealized models used by some philosophers capture the real world in its essential respects. Sure, they might ignore some unpleasant realities. Sure, sometimes debates go badly wrong, sometimes people engage in bad faith, but the sorts of idealized models that someone like Mill is working with are close enough to the real world that we can use them. In particular, they're close enough that we can derive normative conclusions from them. If a course of action would be required in the idealized model, it's the kind of thing that you should do in the real world. The idealized model, you might think, can serve as a regulative ideal. We should try to bring the real world closer to the ideal. So it's here that the book touches on discussions of ideal and non-ideal theory in political philosophy. And in particular, the book draws heavily on Charles Mill's work here. So the book draws on Mill's work more generally because I think that's a perfect example of non-ideal epistemology, but in particular it draws on his critique of ideal theory in political philosophy. So as I understand Mill's critique of ideal theory in political philosophy, the problem he sees with ideal theory is that it only has implications for what we, in a non-ideal world, should do if the assumptions on which it's based are not too distorting or idealistic. Of course, it's perfectly possible to do ideal theory while recognizing that the underlying assumptions are unrealistic. However, there's an unfortunate tendency to downplay how unrealistic the underlying assumptions really are. As a result, Mills thinks, ideal theorists tend to exaggerate the extent to which their theories provide any sort of normative guidance for humans. So applying this sort of critique to epistemology, the claim is that ideal theory, ideal epistemology, isn't problematic because it's idealistic. It's problematic when, and I might add only when, we forget that it's idealistic. When we do that, we make the mistake of thinking that we, in the real world, have a reason to do things that would only be required in an ideal world. So let me try and make this a little bit more concrete. So Mills diagnoses the sort of mistake involved in treating the fact that we would practice colour blindness in an ideal world as a reason to practice colour blindness in a world that is the product of centuries of racism and white supremacism. The fact that in an ideal world we wouldn't see colour in no way entails that in our world we shouldn't recognise colour, for example, in hiring policies, because our world is shaped by centuries of racism. So what I diagnose in the book is a parallel mistake in ideal epistemology, the mistake of treating the fact that ideal inquirers would behave in a certain kind of way. So for example, by striving for intellectual autonomy, that gives us a reason, or gives a reason for actual inquirers to strive for intellectual autonomy. It could be that because of our non-ideal nature, we should behave very differently to how ideal inquirers would behave. Our best epistemic practices have to be responsive to the world in which we find ourselves. It may well be that the best set of epistemic practices for us is very different from the kinds of practices recommended by the historical figures I mentioned earlier, Descartes and Locke. It may be that for us, deference to others, even unthinking, almost blind deference, is a virtue, not a vice. Discussion and debate may be beneficial sometimes, but those benefits aren't equally shared, and particular people may find that any benefits they derive from debate are outweighed by the costs. If we want to figure out what our best epistemic practices are, we have to get into all the messy details of this. Our aim is not to arrive at the one true method of conducting one's reason and seeking truth. Our aim is rather to get a better sense of how humans, situated in the 21st century, from different backgrounds and with different interests, unequal in certain respects, can do a better job of making sense of the world around them. So that's what the book's trying to do. That's it from me. I hope you found that interesting and it made you at least want to go and read the book and see where exactly this all goes wrong. But thanks for listening.